Welcome to the next episode of Volt Discussion Series Shorts. Today we'll be talking with Derek Durham. Derek Durham is a project manager at Volta Solar, and we're just going to discuss what will happen to the solar energy industry after Corona, and especially we're interested in how we can keep up the positive movements and the positive developments the solar industry has experienced until the Corona crisis came along. Good afternoon, Derek.
Good afternoon.
Good. Thank you very much for having time to speak with us. You've been in the solar energy industry for just over 20 years now. So you've really experienced the entire growth of the industry, from growth in terms of product and quality and pricing, but also growth in terms of popularity of the industry. Could you maybe share with us a little bit about how you perceive and have experienced all the changes in the solar industry since you started?
Sure. Well, I began, like you say, around 20 years ago now. At the time, I was in Spain and very much focused on off-grid applications. So putting a couple of panels on someone's house to give them electricity if they didn't have that readily available from the grid. Since then, and due to the introduction largely of incentive schemes and political support policies in different nations, the industry has grown, I wouldn't say exponentially, but it's grown extremely fast, especially over that 20-year period. Prior to the introduction, I would say, of the subsidy systems in Germany specifically, which started the whole ball rolling, there wasn't too much development, but it started really taking off after then, and other countries started to come on board internationally as well as pan-European. Mm-hmm. And the growth has been largely due to, I'd say, two main factors. The first is those subsidies. It is that political support that was introduced in many nations around the world, and the second would be the result of those subsidies. And one of the very reasons these subsidies were introduced in the first place was to increase the economy of scale in order to reduce the pricing of the products, because that was, of course, one of the main obstacles that long ago, 20 years ago, was the price of the panels, which was extremely high. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the main ideas behind the use of subsidy systems was to, like I say, introduce the economy of scale, and that has had the desired effect. So the scale of which we're now introducing and installing solar systems has had the effect of reducing dramatically the pricing of products. Of course, there's been other factors that have played a role. So the role that's being played by Chinese manufacturers, or has been played by Chinese manufacturers over the last, I would say, 10, 12 years now, has had a major impact. But they're only there because their scale of the market has grown so much. Mm-hmm. So those, I would say, are the two factors that have converted solar photovoltaic energy into the major potential source of energy that it is today. Were the incentive schemes that enabled the sharp decline in prices for the products and the systems.
And to what degree has the development of the product itself, I believe you call it the efficiency of the solar cells, to actually generate the energy you need to supply a house or a business with electricity? How has that benefited or profited or been the driver in the development or growth of the industry and the popularity itself?
Well, somewhat surprisingly, the technology of today's commercially available photovoltaic panels has not changed substantially since I began, basically, and since, well, a long time before that. The technology itself remains the same. The efficiency has increased, of course. There have been some improvements in the technology, notable improvements over the years, and that efficiency has increased. So previously, where we were using panels with perhaps a 10% efficiency, 10% obviously extremely low. So if we're looking at a sunny day, maybe you'll get an irradiation level, an input of energy of 1,000 watts per square meter on a nice sunny day. From a 10% efficiency, you would only get 100 watts per square meter out of that panel. Mm-hmm. Now that's been doubled. Over that 20-year period, perhaps you could say it's been doubled. So it's not that we've seen a step change. We've not seen any technological breakthroughs or major technological sector-changing technological breakthroughs. There have been improvements, notable improvements, but we're still using the same technology as we were that long ago.
Okay. And those improvements, am I right to assume that those improvements has helped together with the price reductions due to economies of scale, that those together have made the product attractive for businesses as well as consumers? Or are there other things we should also keep in mind?
No, those improvements have, of course, contributed. The efficiency improvements that I mentioned, we're looking now at 20% efficiency for a solar panel, commercially available solar panel, which seems very low, but all we're talking about is surface area. If you have surface area available, it's not particularly, I would say, relevant to talk about efficiency in that way, because if you have an excess of surface area, it doesn't matter how much you can get per square meter. You just use many more square meters. But yes, those improvements in technology have, of course, helped. So today, if we're talking about a doubling in efficiency over the 20-year period I've been busy, you could then obviously directly relate that to the use of half the surface area that you would have needed to produce the same amount of energy. So basically on your standard rooftop, you can produce more energy now than you were able to. But I would say that the main driver has been the drop in prices, because at the end of the day, it comes down to the bottom line, especially if you're talking to large-scale investors. It's the bottom line that counts. And there has been a tendency towards slightly lower efficiency products because they were far cheaper at one stage. Since then, they've lost favor because the decrease in prices of standard crystalline products has come down to directly compete with them. But it just goes to show that more than the increases in efficiency of the products themselves, it's been the drop in prices that have had such a huge impact on the acceptance and the implementation of solar photovoltaic energy.
Okay, and if I understand correctly, the drop in prices is also partially due to government subsidies, which have been granted, starting in Germany, but also throughout the rest of the world and the Netherlands as well. Is there a difference in the importance of government subsidies to drive that growth when it comes to consumer level, or more at the large-scale project level when it comes to the solar energy? Does one or the other require more subsidy?
I would say that one or the other requiring more subsidy, it's difficult to compare, I would say, a large-scale system with more residential applications. It is also true to say that large-scale investors perhaps are more accustomed to longer payback terms than perhaps your average residential homeowner would be. Or at least they're more willing to accept slightly lower return on the investment, slightly longer payback times. What I would say, though, is that subsidies we're starting to see are becoming less and less necessary to support the growth of the industry because of the decline in prices. So in nations especially where the irradiation levels are rather high, so we're talking now maybe Southern Europe, especially locations such as Spain, Italy, these countries where irradiation levels are very high, we no longer need subsidies to make solar energy, solar voltaic energy competitive with traditional forms of energy production. So
there's no subsidies necessary to make them business viable, actually?
At utility scale, not. So utility scale, when we're talking about large scale implementation of the technology, in these locations, they have now passed what we used to call grid parity, whereby without the need for subsidies, the energy production itself is competitive with other forms of fossil fuel-based energy production. So in those locations and for those types of application, subsidies are no longer necessary. And that's the general tendency right now, is the scaling out or the phasing out of subsidy systems, because they're no longer needed to support the energy technology itself. They've, let's say, played their role. They've had the desired effect. They've increased the economies of scale to the extent that they are no longer necessary, and so should be reduced and eliminated. Cautiously, I have to say, because we have seen cases in some countries where I was working in the Spanish market for many years, up until perhaps now 12 years ago. And at that stage, there were subsidies which were far too favourable, and the cutbacks that the government had to introduce because of that mistake that were made, and the retroactive changes that were applied at that time, not only in Spain but in other European nations as well, had a hugely detrimental effect on the development of the industry. And it's only now that countries like Spain are recovering from those mistakes that were made back then. So in general, though, we're seeing that other forms of financial structure are becoming of more importance than subsidy systems. So PPAs, for example, power purchase agreements, have gained importance, whereby you're selling the energy produced by a solar system at a price which has been negotiated with your electric company. More often than not, this is a large-scale application. And now we're even seeing merchant-based systems, whereby the energy is not sold at a fixed price, but it's sold at the pool price, at the market price at any given moment. So it's a merchant risk analysis that has to be carried out to determine the financial viability of these projects. And again, it's large-scale investments. But even for the small-scale consumer, prices of energy are increasing, at least until very recently, and due to the corona crisis that we're currently going through, they were increasing. And it's therefore no longer, or much less necessary, to subsidize or to promote the use of solar energy financially to enable consumers to reap the benefits of an investment that pays itself back in a reasonably accessible amount of time.
You mentioned earlier that in the south, Italy, Spain, that's where the solar industry has reached grid parity, I believe is the word you used. What's the situation then in Northern Europe? Have we reached grid parity in Northern Europe already, or how far are we away from reaching that?
We're not yet there, but we're pretty close. And we're close enough to enable governments to plan for the phasing out of subsidy systems. So one very clear example is right here in the Netherlands, whereby in the residential market, there's a 1-to-1 net metering policy that's being applied. So all of the excess energy that you produce with your solar panels, which perhaps escapes back to the grid, maybe because you're on holiday in the summer, for example, can be discounted from bills at a later stage throughout the same year, maybe in the winter when you're not producing enough energy to cover your needs. And that 1-to-1, so the fact that your entire kilowatt hour is discounted from a bill at a later stage means that also those taxes that were paid or should be paid on that kilowatt hour are also discounted at a later stage. It therefore becomes another type of subsidy system. And here that's due to be phased out from 2023 until 2031 gradually. And that's simply an indication of the fact that it's no longer deemed necessary. And that's the way changes should be made, is that they should be planned in advance. There should be, the worst thing for our sector, the same as any other sector, is when you get the nasty surprise of a sudden change in support schemes, or a sudden change in governmental policy, whether it be support or simply your ability to produce and consume your own energy. But if those changes, if this phasing out of these support policies can be planned in advance and is foreseeable for the whole industry and is in line with the decline of prices of the products themselves and the systems, it will enable the industry to stand on its own 2 feet without the need for these subsidies at all. And that's where we're heading. The energy transition is taking us in that direction.
Well, you just mentioned the word stability already. That's stability creates the ability for businesses to plan. The government has to realize that stability and offer that stability. The industry as a whole has to create that stability. Of course, we have been touched now by something none of us saw coming in December when we were celebrating Christmas or celebrating New Year's, the coronavirus situation. I'm not a global economic expert, but if I understand correctly, a big problem about the coronavirus is money, the liquidity issue. That's on the short-term level. But quite quickly, the liquidity issue also leads us towards large-scale economic problems in several different industries, and that's not just restaurants and catering, but the entire economic order that we have. That includes government financing, that includes large-scale institutional financing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that stability you just mentioned, have we lost that completely? And now that we're in an unstable situation, what do you as an expert see as the biggest threats on the short and medium long term for the continued development of the solar industry?
I would say those threats haven't yet become too apparent. The threats that we've seen immediately and talking right now while the corona crisis is still ongoing has been more due to issues affecting supply chain. So the availability of products, having enough panels coming into the country to be able to carry out your projects, having the workmanship, the people available to carry out these projects. Bearing in mind all of the measures that have been taken to reduce social interaction, these types of things. Those have had a direct impact, but obviously they're very short term. And in most cases, they're already being resolved, I would say. More medium and long term effects will be due to the economic situation of each country independently. I believe that the sector I'm working in is sufficiently strong right now to be able to weather the storm. I fully believe that, and I fully believe that policies such as the European the European Green Plan, I believe is where we hope to become environmentally neutral by 2050. These can be used as pillars to help the economic redevelopment of Europe. And solar energy can be used as a pillar of that redevelopment as well, as one of the mainstays of the economic recovery of the continent and in general. So yes, there will be an impact inevitably. The more deeper into economic crisis we get, everything, of course, will be affected. But I think we've come far enough down the road for that impact to be minimized. And I think that governments have shown, I talk in general about governments, of course it varies greatly from one nation to another. But here within Europe, I think we've shown that solar energy is here to stay and that there's really no alternative. There's certain things I would like us to carry through after the corona crisis. So, for example, I think we've all been able to see that we've been able to get by using less energy, especially due to transport energy consumption, for example, perhaps not directly related to renewables, but these are some of the mentalities that I would like to see carried through after the crisis, which will enable us to, let's say, develop along a slightly different course than we were prior to this situation, and a course which I believe can happily be more favourable towards the environment.
Will solar energy be able to compete with other energy sources? I mean, if demand caves, demand for energy has been reduced as well, of course. Prices of oil has been reduced. Will solar energy be able to compete with other energy sources purely at a price level during the crisis that we're looking at?
Well, short term or long term, it's very difficult to say. Long term, definitely. There's no turning back, and the tendencies will be continued after the crisis. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. In the short term, there may be some, or there are some impacts of the crisis, which, like you say, the reduce in the price of the barrel, the reduce in energy consumption, the corresponding reduction in the costs of energy and the sale of energy. And many sectors and sources of energy, through becoming a bit desperate perhaps, will be obliged to reduce their prices. But whether they can sustainably reduce their prices to the extent that they will have to in order to survive, so if they can maintain that survival for long enough for them to continue to be competitive, is where the doubt, I think, lies. I do believe that the solar energy industry can continue along the path that we've shown over the last 20 years that we've been able to tread, that we can continue to reduce our costs. I don't believe the same can be said for many of the more traditional sources of energy. So I have no doubt that we're heading in the right direction in the solar energy sector.
Well, that's very good news to hear from my own point of view. I'd like to wrap up this interview with one final question. If you had the power to change something in Europe after Corona, what would it be?
That's a difficult question to answer. And I'm not sure I'd want to change too much. Like I say, I would like to see there be a continuation of some of the questions that are being asked right now with regard to our use of energy. Can we travel less? Can we just continue our economic development and social development and well-being without having to travel as much, for example? Those are questions I think that they're quite valuable. They're quite valuable questions to be asked, and they could be considered a positive outcome of this whole situation, perhaps. For solar itself, I would like to see, like I say, the European Green Deal. I found the right name for the policy. The Green Deal should be continued. We would like to see some policies such as the Green Deal strengthened as a result of the Corona crisis in order to help us to pull through the economic situation that's going to going to come as a result of it. But overall, and speaking personally and from the point of view of the solar photovoltaic energy sector, I think what I'd like to see is continuation, to be able to pick up where we've left off and just carry on as we're doing right now, because I think we're heading in the right direction.
Keep calm and carry on is a very popular English statement from the Second World War. Thank you very much. I'd like to wrap up the interview. Thank you very much, viewers, for watching and listening to this interview. And we'll look forward to seeing you at the next Volta Discussion Series Shorts.